Welcome back. This is the last lecture of the endogenous growth model with human capital investment. And the previous lectures that we did last week, we talked about how, how we set the problem up, how we solved the problem, what some of the math was. I went through a little bit of what the math meant, but I want this lecture to really sort of tie up the intuition. I wanted to really devote an entire lecture just on what the intuition of the model was, sort of the economic predictions, we could say, that the model generated and why it's useful for policy analysis, why we would actually care about this kind of stuff. And so this being a model that really gives us more intuition that's sort of easy to digest than the other models, it seemed like, one, a decent place to end the entire growth section, because we can actually sort of see the culmination of all of these growth models and how they've evolved over time, but also talk about ways that these models have been applied in more applied settings. So we're going to do a quick recap of some of the math, just to sort of make sure we're all kind of on the same page with this stuff. Then we're going to go over some intuition of it, what it means. I'm going to apply that intuition to two different applications. One being a more pop culture reference by showing a scene out of a really fun movie, actually. And then another showing a news political opinion-ish news segment. And I'm going to talk about where some of these movies and news segments get things right, where they get some things wrong. Then we're going to explain how the model can be tweaked, the way that it's been advanced over the years, and we're going to wrap up some stuff with some research applied actually to a pretty interesting scenario, and that's going to tie up with where some of my research in the growth and development field has gone. And then there will be one more lecture after this, which actually discusses what that research is, and that will entirely wrap up the growth section. So we'll be done with growth by the middle of this week, and we can start business cycles. Hooray! So if you remember from last time, this was the objective function that we had. Really no different than what we saw before. Now, we had, obviously, constraints that the objective function was subject to, and we were trying to maximize consumption over this infinite time horizon. The first one's a production function. Well, looks pretty similar to what we had before, except there's that ht to the 1 minus alpha, right, where ht was human capital. We had typical resource constraint, like what we saw before, and, oh, wow, okay, yeah, this investment thing was a little different. Now, in the previous model, where we just had the endogenous growth model with perpetual growth that had human capital spillovers, the investment equation, the law of motion of capital, right, sort of assumed that the capital could be like physical, it could be human capital, they were kind of lumped together, and there would be spillovers of human capital, and if there were spillovers, there were different scenarios, right? You could have like the negative spillovers where it's sort of like coming up with a really terrible idea like the shake weight, right? That thing kind of sucked. Nobody really used it. There could be cases where you had like massive spillovers that went well above and beyond what the returns were, and that's where you would see like really crazy fast growth and you would not have a stable, steady state equilibrium. And there was one that perfectly offset these spillovers, right, where you basically just had like constant returns to scale just in capital. That was sort of like what we generally see, right? That sort of gave us a nice balanced growth path, so to speak. This model split the capital up into physical capital and human capital. So we have a law of motion really for two different types of capital, one for physical, one for human. Now, there could be a case, you could make the argument that there is depreciation of physical capital, so you would have that like 1 minus delta term in front of that kt in equation 4, but I didn't really want to go through that, and it needlessly complicated a bunch of things, and it's honestly a little bit more, interesting and, maybe not interesting, more intuitive, and a little bit easier just to kind of look at it this way, where there's no depreciation of physical capital, but there also is just sort of by design no depreciation of human capital because it doesn't really depreciate, right? Human capital really appreciates because there's no human capital really. There's no like knowledge base that you're like, well, you know what? We're just going to forget that. We don't remember that anymore. No, it's already in books. It's already been developed. It's already been put to use. Now, we might find uses for for certain types of human capital, right? Certain types of ideas, right? There might be certain uses for that kind of, well, wear out their welcome. We'll actually talk about that quite a bit with business cycle modeling. But if you consider even like the solo model, right? Nobody really uses the solo model that much anymore because there are other models that are a lot better and that are a lot more precise, that explain a lot more of the variance in GDP over time than just the solo model did. But we still built upon the solo model, and people still learn the solo model because it's useful to understand how that works when we're trying to figure out sort of what the dynamics are in macroeconomic modeling. It's a very useful tool. It's more of a learning tool now. It's not so much a research tool, but more of a learning tool, but it's still very useful, and it's pretty intuitive. It's nice to understand, but we built off of that, right? So we're not just going to throw the solo model away. We will in research, but it still has other types of uses. And so that's kind of what this HT plus 1 minus HT thing is telling us, that there's at least no depreciation of human capital over time. And that's an interesting distinction and a very necessary distinction that we have to make. So, yeah, I said HT was human capital, so that HT plus 1 minus HT describes the flow of human capital, sort of like a law of motion of human capital. So now we can invest in both physical and human capital, and there are two separate types of inputs in the production function, physical and human capital. Now, when we set up the Bellman equation, did all that differentiation stuff, hooray, math, right, we got a result that basically suggested this, right? So what is equation 5? What does that tell me? Well, what that tells me is that the left-hand side, which is the marginal product of physical capital, is equal to the right-hand side, which is the marginal product of human capital, right? So in English, the marginal products of physical and human capital are equal when the agents are optimizing and these markets are in equilibrium. So this result suggested that if we're optimizing, right, if we're the agent, we're optimizing, we're investing in both physical and human capital up to the point where their marginal products are equal. So you would invest in these, to where the returns on investment are the same. So if, in theory, if the return on human capital is, say, 5%, right, then you would be investing in physical capital up until the point where the return on physical capital is also 5%. Well, basically it means that both types of capital are important. We need physical capital because, we need these machines, we need things, we need stuff to make more stuff, physical capital, we need that. But we also need human capital, right? Someone has to design that stuff. Someone has to know even how to use that stuff. That's where that's where the human capital comes into play, and that's where the importance of human capital comes into play when comparing it to physical capital. So let's think about this when it comes to, looking at watching movies, TV, etc. Have you ever seen that movie Dazed and Confused? I guess there's no point in even asking that because, again, this is not being made in real time, so it's not like I'm getting a bunch of no, what the hell is that? So, okay, forget that I asked that. There's a movie called Dazed and Confused. Came out, I think, in like 1990, 91, something like that. Takes place in the late 70s, and it's really it's a fun movie. It's kind of like a day in the life of a bunch of these like high school kids, really kind of raging in age between incoming freshmen and upcoming seniors. And it sort of looks at just how they sort of spend a day / a night kind of all interacting, the way that a couple of the like incoming freshmen get hazed by like the incoming seniors because like it's apparently like their thing that they do or something. I don't really know. Hooray, hazing! And it's really a lot of fun. It's just a great movie to watch. It's not mean. It's not nasty. Yeah, okay. There's some drug use. I think there's some sex. There's some really bad language. There's a lot of like sex references. But I mean, come on. These are like teenagers. They swear a lot. They say bad things. It's just that's part of being like a high schooler. As I'm sitting here remembering some of the awful things that happened when I was in high school. Not awful, like terrible, just awful, like, people just said gross things. So anyways, we'll just go ahead and forget that I said any of that. And let's go ahead and take a quick look at the scene from Dazed and Confused. Now, there's a little bit of bad language. I think there's like a shit in there or something like that. I've skipped through a couple of different clips that I didn't really want to show. A couple of really bad sex jokes. There's some drug use that I skip don't even really get to, let's be honest. I'm just showing one particular clip. Now, some of you might actually recognize this scene. This is the scene with Matthew McConaughey where he's this guy, I think he's like early 20s or something like that, and he's still hanging out with a bunch of high schoolers. Everybody knew like that guy in high school that graduated high school and just sort of still hung around with high schoolers. It's kind of like, dude, what the hell are you doing? And he's definitely that guy. And there's that scene, I'm sure you've probably all heard about it, that is from this movie where he's like, yeah, that's what I like about these high school girls, man. I get older, they stay the same age. Yes, they do. Well, this is actually from that scene. This is just like right before he says that, because that's kind of a really gross statement when you think about it. Like, you're like, okay, it's funny, and then you sit and think about it and stew on it, have a cup of coffee while you're thinking about it. You're like, wow, it's really gross. That's like really, really gross. But anyways, yeah, so this is right before he says that. Hopefully giving you that line kind of made you go, oh yeah, that movie, I've heard about this, yeah. This is where Matthew McConaughey is talking about, instead of, trying to chase after high school girls, possibly going back to school, right? Investing in his own human capital accumulation, and why he either would or wouldn't want to do that. So let's watch the scene, and then we can kind of break down some of the right after.
Yes, sir.
What have you been up to?
Same old shit, man.
Yeah?
Working for the city.
Working man, huh?
Been thinking about getting back in school, though, man.
Back in JC or something like that?
Yeah, man. I mean, that's where all the girls are, right?
Yes, they are.
But on the other hand, man, I just as soon keep working, keep a little change in my pocket.
Yeah? Wait.
Rather than spend my time listening to some dipshit who doesn't know what the hell he's talking about anyway.
I know what you're talking about.
Okay, so hopefully you recognize that movie. If you don't, well then, I guess still that scene kind of does make sense. There's not really much context to put into that scene, right? Now let's ignore the part where he's talking about, like, that's where all the girls are, and think about the actual schooling, all right? So aside from, saying really gross things all the time, he's really talking about his own expected return on human capital investment, because to him, the return on human capital investment isn't high enough to induce him to go to school and invest in his own human capital accumulation. So we can ask ourselves, ceteris paribus, all things equal, is he optimizing? Well, maybe, maybe not. It's more likely that actually he's not, because he's underestimating the return to human capital investment, and thus there are possible welfare losses that can be realized from his potentially bad decision making. Now, there's a lot of other examples that we can use too. It's not just like from that movie, right? Because in that movie, basically, he's likely assuming that the return on human capital investment is either not equal to the return on physical capital investment, or that it's just not high enough to want to induce him to go to school. So if you think about like the Euler equation, for example, right? His own time preferences wouldn't really be reflected in a scenario where the two... Let me rephrase that. His time preferences are basically overpowering the return on human capital investment. So for him, rather than go to school, right, and listen to, quote, some dipshit who doesn't know what the hell he's talking about, it's probably more like when he says, like, I'd rather just keep a little extra change in my pocket. Well, that's called my time preferences don't induce me to go invest in more human capital accumulation, because I'm more interested in consuming now rather than upping my potential consumption later by investing in human capital and increasing my future income. It's just not really something that he's particularly interested in. But there's other ways that we can apply this and think about this model. And the other one isn't really a real world scenario. It's, a fictional movie. But here's a slightly more real world scenario. It's still kind of a fictional take on real world stuff. But there's a lot of conservative political commentators who like to talk about how bad it is to get like higher education. So we're just going to ignore the politically charged rhetoric. I don't want this to turn into a political debate whatsoever. It's not my job to teach you any sort of like indoctrination one way or the other. Yes, I do have my own political beliefs. I would pretty much imagine any adult would have, to some extent, their own political beliefs, whether they actually care about politics or they're like, my political beliefs are, I don't give a shit about politics and I don't want to like alienate my family at Thanksgiving. Now, a lot of guys a lot of political commentators, really across the board, but I see it more often on the right than I do the left, make this mistake, and it really makes me nuts. Like, I hate hearing, oh, well, college is a scam, college is bullshit, or something like that. One of the guys that does this is Tucker Carlson. Now, he's not as bad about it as a lot of the others, but it's still... There's another clip I'm going to show you that is equally as interesting as what we just saw. We can talk about it a little bit more, so maybe it's actually more interesting. Okay. This is what happens when your Vyvanse hasn't kicked in yet at like 9 o'clock in the morning or something like that. But Tucker Carlson does make some pretty egregious statements about how like he thinks schooling is a scam or something, like it's just not worth it anymore. I don't really know. I'm going to assume that some of you know who he is and some of you don't. He's the guy that makes this face all the time. That like, what in the hell did I just hear? And he can say a lot of dumb things. I've heard him say a lot of really stupid shit in the past. And again, I just want to go ahead and make this painfully clear. I'm just going to hedge here. This isn't to knock conservatism or liberalism or anything else, because, like, again, it is not my job to teach you how to think, and it is not my job to shape your political beliefs by telling you what mine are and telling you that you should think that like the exact same way as I do. That's not a particularly fair way to go about things. I would rather just show you some models, show you some applications of the models, and allow you to kind of get your own beliefs out of that. Whether you are of the political right, political left, economic right, economic left, is really of no concern to me, because what matters to me is that you learn how to think in a more objective way using some of these more advanced, more like cutting edge economic models that can actually sort of let you squeeze some pretty interesting intuition out in a way that is allowing you to sort of identify movements in just like one particular variable rather than having like a bunch of different variables all moving at once. You're like, oh, okay, well, if we change this, but, you know, there's all these other, like, weird intertwined sort of, like, confounding factors. It just doesn't really matter. Screw it, whatever. No, like, it's my goal to teach you to use these models that don't make that mistake, where you can just go, okay, if X is going to happen, then Y will be the result. And so, anyways, enough hedging about that. Tucker has said a lot of things that don't make sense. I mean, to be fair, he said things that do make sense. And he's kind of, I'd like to say he says things that make more sense, or says more things that make sense and things that don't, but it's almost a crapshoot. Like, if I'm ever home and my parents are watching Tucker Carlson, it's about a 50-50 shot that I'll end up screaming at the TV screen at some point. Like, one of the things that he said on multiple occasions is, like, technological innovation should be regulated by the government because, like, I don't know, somehow, like, the gains from the technological advancement can actually impose welfare costs on society or something, and then it's up to the government to fix it. And, of course, then he immediately turns around and, like, decries, like, populist economic thinking. It's like, dude, that's a pretty populist thought process. But aside from just knocking technological innovation, right, like, I'm sorry, if a firm develops something that's good, right, that's beneficial, right, generates, like in the previous model, human capital spillovers, that shouldn't be regulated by the government because, well, you're improving things. You're improving the efficiency at which things are being produced, right? That means cheaper production, lower prices. It's just all around better. And it allows for a sort of reallocation of the labor force, a reallocation of different types of investment, physical capital investment, human capital investment, things that actually matter, that drive society, that drive economic growth in, well, not just the U.S., but across the world. But aside from saying that, he's also questioned the value of a college education while having a quality one himself. So let's go ahead and watch another video, this time of Tucker Carlson asking about whether or not he thinks college is, quote-unquote, worth it.
Generational improvement is the basic promise of American life. In this country, you can do better than your parents did, and many have. The main driver of upward mobility in America is higher education. Get an education, we tell our children. Go to college and make something of yourself. For more than 100 years, that has been true. But is it still true? Is college still worth it? For some, the answer obviously is yes. Our physicians, engineers, research scientists are still the best in the world. For them, college is essential and well worth it. But what about the rest of us? How about your average sociology major or political science major at fill-in-the-blank state U? How about a Russian studies major at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, a path I know well? Well, that remains an open question. We're going to spend the next month trying to answer it. There are a lot of ways to assess the costs and benefits of college, its effect on students, the many ways it changes the society. We'll get to all of those in this series, which is every Wednesday night. But tonight we want to begin with the economics of college, the numbers. College is expensive. That's the first thing to know about it. Over the past 30 years, the cost of a four-year education at a public university has risen by 213%, a rate far faster than inflation. A lot of that cost is financed with debt. About 40 million Americans now have student loans. Outstanding student loan debt in this country about $1.4 trillion. That's equal to more than a third of the entire federal budget. And the numbers are rising fast. In 1993, for example, the average student loan holder owed about $9,400. Today, the average balance is more than $34,000. Studies show that most kids who take loans never bother to calculate their monthly payment when they apply for the loans. It's not surprising that the majority say they would not do it again. About half of loan holders worry they won't be able to pay off their loans over the course of their lifetimes. Well, some will and some won't, but lenders don't appear to make those decisions when they loan the money. They don't seem to care. Almost a third of students who sign up for student loans drop out before getting a degree, and that makes it much less likely they'll earn enough to pay back the money. Even if they do graduate, there aren't enough jobs to support them. More than 40% of young college graduates work in positions that do not require a college degree. Certain majors, of course, lead to better jobs and higher incomes, but lenders don't seem to take that into consideration either, especially the government. Over the school year 2015-2016, the federal government handed out more than $4 billion in loans to psychology majors, handed out another $3.5 billion to students majoring in visual and performing arts. Some of these students will go on to high-paying jobs, probably. Some will have no problem repaying their loans. But many, many others won't have that experience. Student debt is crushing an entire generation of Americans. Young people with student loans are far less likely to buy cars, buy homes, get married, have children than their parents' generation was. And their attitudes are very different as a result. When you see those polls showing that young people prefer socialism to capitalism, you're probably horrified. You should know that student loan debt is one of the big reasons why. It was also a major factor in Bernie Sanders' sudden rise to national celebrity. It's also a big factor in our country's drift toward populist economics. Our elites mostly don't notice any of this because, of course, it doesn't affect them. But student loan debt is making our politics far more radical. If you like capitalism, you ought to be very worried about student loan debt. So what are we getting in return for all of this? Well, you'd hope a well-educated population. No. A 2003 study by the Department of Education, for example, gave a literacy test to 18,000 adults with college degrees. Fewer than a third were found to be proficient. That was a measure of a humanities education. At Harvard, a researcher took a close look at students studying the hard sciences. Among the findings, quote, students who receive honor grades in college-level physics courses frequently are unable to solve basic problems and questions encountered in a form slightly different from that in which they have been formally instructed and tested. In other words, when they got outside the classroom, they failed. Well, if you're going to send an entire generation deep into debt, that is not an adequate return on investment. But it's not really surprising when you consider how college students actually spend their time. It's been studied a lot. One survey found that the average full-time college student spends less than 3 hours a day on education-related activities of any kind. Students, meanwhile, spend almost 3 times as much time shopping, eating, and hanging around as they did going to class or doing homework. It's a nice life if you can get it, but in the end, it's a very costly vacation for all of us. Is it worth it?
And of course, in the interest of fairness, I am going to show at least one spot, one area where he says something that is absolutely correct.
This is a crisis. So you would think that colleges would respond by increasing academic rigor. But the opposite has happened. A survey of the top public universities in America found that only 9 schools required an economics course for graduation, for example. Only 5 required a survey course in America.
Okay. Just to go ahead and talk about that thing with the economics course, I'm kind of with him on that one. I think everybody should take an economics course. There's, of course, no bias here whatsoever. But anyways, so yeah, to be fair, he's not saying that all college is a scam. He does acknowledge the need for STEM field work. He's not like totally anti-schooling. I mean, those guys are out there and they really piss me off. But, just to go ahead and just kind of, knock a couple things here and there. There's a couple of things that he does that really does just completely drive me up the wall. Like, I hate how he says we all the time. It's like, well, over the next month, we're going to be looking at X, Y. It's like, dude, we're not going to be doing anything. Like, I'm going to be turning the TV off in a couple of seconds, and I'm not going to be following you for the next month. And there's some other things that he does talk about that I just want to say that we're not going to be bringing up right now. First is the student loan stuff, right? So he's talking about how a lot of these students are taking out student loans. Maybe we're just going to not. I don't want to complicate this discussion by trying to add that in there, because there are a lot of things that the human capital investment model that we're looking at is leaving out. So we're also going to leave out the stuff about proficiency, where there are differentials in outcomes in schooling, not based on anything other than just, well, some kids just don't really care. So that's sort of another abstraction that the model makes. And it's like, okay, yeah, kids party. Big deal. Like, I partied through school. I partied through undergrad. I partied in grad school, maybe not quite as much as I did in undergrad, because I actually, really, really, really wanted to stay in grad school. I mean, I wanted to stay in undergrad, but grad school is much more difficult. But it's like, okay, yeah, kids party. Sometimes kids party more than they actually study. Some kids can party more than they need to study. Other times it's, well, not really the case. It's kind of why I didn't really party anywhere near as much in grad school as I did undergrad. But another thing that he talks about here that kind of drove me up the wall was he's like, oh, populist economics. Well, he's sitting here saying very populist things. And a lot of his other views on the economy are very populist. And it's like, I don't know what you think you're trying to say. But anyways, I'm going off on a tangent here. And he's suggesting that, okay, yeah, STEM field work matters, right? The med school stuff, scientific research, math, those areas, engineering, right? Those areas are important. He's saying they're important, and I agree with him on that. But he's suggesting that there are other fields that really aren't as important. And like I said, he's not entirely wrong, but there are plenty of liberal arts degrees that are useful, right? Business degrees, law degrees, psych degrees, international affairs, hell, even econ degrees matter, right? AV stuff, like, I don't know, what was used to produce his show, right? You need someone who knows how to do that. You need someone who knows how to write music. You need someone who knows how to record music. I can tell you from personal experience, that shit's hard. Just imagine how the world would work without those majors, right? And he's also made arguments that there won't be enough new jobs for college grads that require a college degree, except in previous years, the BLS put estimates out that said by this year, and honestly, if there was not the COVID-19 pandemic, this would probably still be holding true right now, that there would be an overwhelming majority of new jobs that are being created that require a college degree. Now, to him, the marginal product of physical capital is much greater than the marginal product of human capital, which would imply that there's too much human capital investment going on, not enough physical capital investment going on. But there's plenty of evidence to the contrary to what he said. So what the hell's going on? Well, he just doesn't really know what the hell he's talking about, because there's more than enough evidence out there to suggest that there is a need for college graduates. And another thing that's interesting is a lot of times your college degree isn't necessarily just to train you in that one particular field, but also to train you kind of how to think outside the box. Now, there was that study that he cited where basically they tested these graduates on things that were mildly different than what they learned in school, and some of them couldn't keep up. And yeah, that is an issue. But overall, the point of higher education isn't just to teach you that like explicitly specific material, but also to teach you how to think objectively, how to think outside the box, how to approach problems in a new and interesting way. And in addition to that, well, the more innovation we have, the more we're going to need college, right? Bernard Riemann, if any of you have taken Calculus 1, the very end of Calculus 1 with the integral, well, that was thanks to Riemann. Maybe you remember hearing about the Riemann sum, when you were taking that course. He couldn't have developed the formal use of the integral without Isaac Newton's research on differentiation, which means that Riemann himself, good old Bernard, had to invest in his own human capital in order to be able to build on what there already was. Now, the same can be said of any technological change that has really occurred on the backs of previous work, right? And it's not just in STEM fields. It can be applied to other areas as well. And sadly, a high school degree just won't give you the training you need. And maybe that means we need to consider not just the quantity of human capital investment, but the quality of human capital investment, in which case Tucker's making some points that aren't entirely irrefutable. And you can get the human capital investment that you need via on-the-job training. So I don't want you to think this is just schooling, right? You can choose to invest in your own human capital accumulation by, say, developing managerial skills via on-the-job training, right? Internships, that's kind of on-the-job training to an extent, right? If you want to be a manager at your company, right? Say you work at this cool company or maybe a not-so-cool company, who knows? If you want to be a manager, well, you're probably going to work your way up the ladder, and as you do, you're going to learn more about how to become an effective leader, right? That is, in and of itself, a form of human capital investment. That doesn't mean to abandon any or all forms of higher education like college, tech schools, etc. It just means that there are other ways that you can develop your human capital, which would kind of make Tucker's point at least a little bit more accurate. But there's also the possibility that we could split the labor force up into two types of workers, right? Instead of looking just at workers who produce ideas, right? The human capital investment stuff. There can also be workers who produce things, right? This type of a specification could make some arguments against going to college at least a little bit easier to make, but you still need formal training in your trade, right? If you want to become a welder, one of my best friends is a welder, and he had to go to school for it, and it took him a very long time, and he's still kind of getting like a lot of on-the-job training, even though he's been done with school for years at this point. So is there a way that we could tweak the model? Possibly. Let's consider something like this. Right? We could consider a specification where we've got two different types of human capital inputs, right? So this H sub TI is human capital for workers who produce ideas, right? So by ideas here, what I mean are like software developers, pharmaceutical researchers, automotive designers, economists, etc., things like that, right? HTS would be human capital for workers that produce stuff. They produce things. By stuff, what I mean is workers who work on the production line, assembling hardware for computers, making new medicines that were developed by these pharmaceutical researchers, assembling the cars that were designed by the automotive engineers, binding books written by incredibly brilliant economists. Give myself a pat on the back. One day, maybe one of my books will be published. That'd be kind of cool. But there's also other types of human capital for workers who produce stuff, like welding, construction work, right? These are things that matter. These are skills that need to be learned. You don't just go on the job immediately just nailing everything that you're doing, right? So if we could separate that, right, we have basically like a high-skilled, I don't want to say high-skilled and low-skilled because there are plenty of workers that produce stuff, probably have way more skills than what I've got. Some of this stuff is actually really, really difficult. But human capital for workers that produce ideas, right, workers that make ideas, workers that make stuff. Well, this would allow for two different types of returns to human capital investment and could possibly explain variations in the college and tech school enrollments. But there are other types of human capital investment models that are pretty interesting, actually. There are other things we can do to this model to explain what we're seeing in the historical data. Right? For example, Tamura, Simon, and Murphy, you might recognize those first two names there. They're professors at Clemson University, Robert Tamura and Curtis Simon. They developed a paper in 2017 that develops a theoretical model that looks at fertility and schooling choices between white and black families during Jim Crow and segregation in the U.S. I've actually worked on some research with this, formulating an empirical test of this particular model with Robert Tamura. That was part of my dissertation research that I finished last year. The model, the theoretical one, is a dynastic human capital accumulation model, so really not that far off from what we saw, that considers households can really be of one of two types. They can be white or black. So that depending on their race, right? There will be sort of different structures imposed on the model itself. And one of the many issues that the model sets out to address is one with schooling choices between white and black families. Now, the model assumes that there are differentials in the marginal and total time cost of schooling observed by white and black families separately. And there are two key parameters when it comes to the schooling stuff. There's kappa, which is the marginal time cost of schooling, right? So, and this, like that I subscript, so the kappa IT, that I is either white or black, which denotes the race of the household. So if kappa is the marginal time cost of schooling, you would have kappa tau be the total time cost of schooling, where tau is the number of expected years of schooling for that particular birth cohort of that particular race. Now, the model implies that these parameters, the marginal and total time cost of schooling, for black students was much higher than what it was for white students during the time horizon that the model sets out to address, to analyze. And it can really help explain a lot of the inequality between whites and blacks that are observed even to this day. And there's forthcoming research, mine, that empirically tests those two key parameters in the model. And yep, spoiler alert, it does actually confirm the predictions of the model that black families faced much higher costs of schooling, which can explain these differentials in human capital accumulation that have been observed between the two races, even after the barriers to equal access to education were removed, right? So even though there's no longer unequal access to schooling, right? Because during Jim Crow, during segregation, there was flat out just legal barriers that did not allow black students to go to the same schools as white students, right? Those barriers have now been removed. Now, that isn't to say that there isn't any systemic discrimination, any systemic racism, anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying when those legal barriers were removed, there was a more equal access to schooling for these two different races. So to wrap this up, there's one more lecture on this stuff, and that's where I'm going to go a little bit further into that one model that I was just talking about. And we're going to look at the empirical test. So we're actually going to see how these models can actually be tested. Because, yeah, you learned a bunch of these theoretical models, but you haven't really seen much in the way of empirical evidence to suggest whether or not they're good models. Really, the only evidence that you've heard was me just saying, oh, yeah, this model's better, this model's worse. All right, this model improves on this. This model adds this and this and this, which, can increase the accuracy or the precision of the model. But you haven't really seen any actual hard empirical evidence to suggest that outside of just taking my word for it. So we're going to look at how these models can be tested and sort of what we can get out of these models, right? How can we confirm whether these are good or bad models? For example, with the black and white schooling paper that I did with Dr. Tamura, we confirm basically that one, the marginal and total time cost for schooling for black families was much higher than what it was for white families during this period. But we also confirm the fit of the way the model is calibrated, because these types of models, you can write a computer program to solve them out, and you can calibrate or tailor certain exogenous parameters. You can set certain initial conditions, and when you analytically solve the model out, right, when you put these numbers in for the parameters, for the variables, etc., it will eventually find a solution path. It'll converge to some solution path. And in the numbers that are generated by the model, by doing this, you can then compare that to the numbers that are actually observed in the real world. So while the model generated a bunch of these numerical predictions, what my paper does, what the empirical research does, is it then goes out and says, okay, cool, how does the real world data fit with the estimated or not estimated, predicted data generated by the theoretical model itself? Now, this isn't to say that the numbers are going to be identical. They rarely are. However, you will see that while the numbers might be different, the distributions aren't all that different. And so when we run regressions testing this stuff, right? If we do it in a certain way, we basically allow some of those those differences to sort of drop out, kind of get washed out, quote unquote, into like the constant term of this regression estimate that we get. And we can look basically at just sort of like in a nice reduced form specification, okay, what is the correlation between the two? Are they correlated, right? So, the model might generate 10 and the real world data might generate 100, right? But even though those numbers are different, right, if we look at sort of like percentage changes or put them in percentages and we go and analyze this stuff, right, the moments of the distributions may not really be all that different from each other. So they could be very highly correlated, even though one is sort of like a scalar multiple of the other. That scalar multiple will get washed out, and we can look at just whether or not these two figures are correlated. Now, I'm going to go through the model. We're going to talk about that, and you will see that they are, in fact, correlated, and they also back up the prediction of the model that these there were seriously major differentials in these perceived costs of schooling, right? The cost of schooling that these houses go, okay, well, I want to plan for my kids to go to school. So I imagine that, the cost of schooling, or sort of like an opportunity cost of schooling, is going to be much higher if the family is black, does not have the same access to educational attainment, the same access to quality education. The opportunity cost of getting additional years of schooling is going to be much higher because it's not as worth it, right? The return isn't going to be as high as it would have been for a white family during Jim Crow and segregation. And that's sort of what the empirical model sets out to test. But that's getting a little bit further into another lecture. So until then, peace out. And there will be another video coming up, actually in your time, probably within 5 minutes of this one being posted, but my time about another hour. So be on the lookout. And until then, later.